They say, to win a land dispute in court, you need two things: a powerful legal team and a thick wallet. Elliot Granger had neither. He walked into court with an old leather briefcase, a stack of documents he had organized himself over 6 months, and a look in his eyes that anyone who had ever seen his films would recognize the look of a man who does not break easily. Haven Ridge was a peaceful coastal town until the roar of cranes and cement mixers shattered the calm. A luxury resort rose just steps from the forest's edge, right beside Elliot's land, and then quickly expanded into property he had owned since 1991. He wrote letters, made phone calls, filed petitions. No one responded. Instead, Calvin Maddox, the chairman of Maddox Urban Developments, built fences, poured foundations, and then told the press that everything had been approved. To him, it was just another deal, another 5-star resort overlooking the ocean, a multi-million-dollar asset. To Elliot, it was the last piece of his wife's memory. It was where he used to plant lavender every spring. It was the land he had promised to protect, not for himself, but for his 3-year-old grandson. And when every attorney turned him down, citing insufficient evidence to win or an opponent too powerful, Elliot made a choice no one expected. He decided to represent himself in court. That morning, the Haven Ridge County courtroom was packed, not because the case was important, but because people came to see Elliot Granger fail. There were muffled chuckles when the silver-haired old man walked up to the plaintiff's table. Judge Wendell Craig, known for his stern manner, half-joked, half-warned, "Mr. Granger, you do know this isn't a cowboy movie, right? This is a courtroom, not Hollywood." Maddox sat on the other side, smirking. His attorney, a young man brimming with confidence, nodded slightly as if to say, "Relax, this will be over in no time." Elliot said nothing. He simply laid his file on the table, looked the judge square in the eye, and said, "I'm not here to perform, Your Honor. I'm here to take back what's mine." No one knew that day would mark the beginning of one of the most closely watched trials in America. No one expected that a man nearly 90 years old, with no law degree, no influence in elite circles, could make an entire power structure sit upright and listen. And least of all did they expect that the only thing Elliot brought with him, not fame, not money, but the truth, would be the one thing no one could defeat. The first strike of the gavel echoed at 9:02 a.m. Judge Wendell Craig, who had presided over hundreds of civil disputes, entered, his black robe flowing, his expression stern. He scanned the room, packed with reporters, onlookers, and those who had come merely to watch the show. Then his gaze settled on Elliot Granger, the silver-haired man in a plain button-down and a classic wool coat. No lawyer at his side, no assistant, just him and that worn leather briefcase. The judge squinted slightly. "Mr. Granger," the judge said, sliding on his glasses. "I'm told you've chosen to represent yourself. Are you certain about that?" Elliot didn't rush to his feet. He simply nodded with calm resolve and replied, "Yes, sir. I've studied this case for 6 months. I know what I'm doing." A few people in the courtroom chuckled quietly. A reporter whispered, This is about to turn into a tragic comedy. On the other side of the courtroom, Calvin Maddox sat with his legs crossed, leaning back as if enjoying a stage play. His lawyer, Wyatt Mercer, sharp-featured and dressed in an expensive grey suit, didn't bother to hide his mocking grin. "Very well. Let's proceed," Judge Craig announced. Elliot walked up to the plaintiff's stand. Every step was firm despite being 89 years old. No one assisted him. No one introduced him. It was just him and an eerie hush beginning to settle over the room. He opened his file, pulled out a land survey map, and held it high. "In 1991, I purchased this land. The paperwork is complete. I've lived on it, worked on it, planted on it, and cared for every inch." He placed a stack of documents on the table. "These are all the letters I sent to Maddox Corporation to object to their encroachment on my land. Sent 3 times. Not a single response." Wyatt rose to his feet, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Your Honor, if I may, does Mr. Granger realize this isn't a civics class? Perhaps he's read a few law books, but this is a court of law." Laughter trickled through the room. Elliot didn't look at him. He simply laid down an aerial photograph, clearly marked with dates. "This is a photo of my land, before they poured concrete, tore down my fence, and planted pillars right where my wife used to grow lavender." The room fell silent. Wyatt shrugged, as if to say, "Emotion isn't law." Elliot turned his gaze to Judge Craig. "I'm not here to tell a story. I'm here to ask the court one thing. When someone knowingly invades your land, ignores all warnings, and treats silence as consent, isn't that an illegal act?" Judge Craig remained still. The question was simple, but it made the room hold its breath. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "In principle, yes," Judge Craig said quietly. Elliot bowed his head, then calmly took his seat. No threats, no theatrics, just evidence, a question, and absolute composure. By then, the early chuckles had vanished. No one spoke anymore. Instead, every eye turned toward the quiet old man seated alone, as if realizing this was no ordinary trial. Attorney Wyatt Mercer stood, walking to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had won hundreds of corporate lawsuits. He glanced at Elliot, then addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich with inflection, "which of us hasn't encountered a minor misunderstanding about property lines, a fence off by a few inches, an error in a decades-old survey? That's not a crime. That's reality." He turned back toward Elliot, his gaze sly. "And with all due respect, Mr. Granger, you are not a lawyer. You were an actor, I'll grant you that, but this is a courtroom, not a film set." A soft ripple of laughter spread from the back row. Wyatt continued, "You've played scenes of judgment, condemned villains on screen. But I'm afraid reality isn't that simple. The law isn't something you just read and understand. It's a system, built on precedent and procedure, and those things, sir, can't be learned in 6 months of reading documents at home." He turned to the judge with a polite smile. I respectfully ask the court to consider dismissing the majority of Mr. Granger's exhibits as they lack the legal foundation necessary for admissibility. Elliot remained still. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply stood, adjusted his collar, and said, "I don't need to be a lawyer to know when my land's been stolen." The room went dead silent. Elliot stepped into the center of the courtroom, holding a high-resolution color photograph, an aerial image of his property from 2021 taken by drone. Then he held up a second photo showing concrete structures built just inches from his old fence line. "This is my land, registered 30 years ago, and this," he moved to the next photo, "is when Maddox Corporation tore it apart." He placed the 3 photographs on the witness stand, directly in front of the jury. Then he turned to Wyatt. "You're right. I didn't study law, but I can read. I know that when someone ignores letters, bypasses permits, and puts up fences inside my boundary line, that's not a misunderstanding. That's intentional trespass." Wyatt raised an eyebrow, attempting to maintain composure. "Your Honor, objection. Mr. Granger is speculating about intent, something that cannot be proven." Judge Craig frowned. He looked at Wyatt, then back at Elliot. Elliot calmly opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 letters, each 2 pages long, postmarked and stamped with signed receipts of delivery. "These are the 3 times I asked Maddox to stop construction. Each letter included maps and legal documentation." Then he held up a 4th letter. "And this is the letter they sent me 2 months later, saying they had no obligation to respond. It's signed by Maddox's CEO himself." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Judge Craig gave a slow nod and picked up the letter to examine it. He didn't speak, but his eyes said enough. This was no longer just another lawsuit. Elliot turned to Wyatt one final time. "I didn't come here to perform, Mr. Mercer. I brought the truth, and I don't need a law degree to prove who's lying." And for the first time since the trial began, Wyatt Mercer said nothing. The air in the courtroom grew thick. No one laughed anymore. No one looked at Elliot Granger as just a senile old man. The room sat still for a few beats before Judge Craig spoke. "Mr. Granger, if you have any witnesses, please present them." Elliot didn't respond right away. He slowly rose to his feet, then turned calmly toward the defense. "No witness knows this story better than the man who ordered the construction himself." He looked directly at Calvin Maddox, the CEO of Maddox Urban Developments, who sat behind the defense table, casually cracking his knuckles as if he still had everything under control. "I request that Mr. Maddox be called to the stand for questioning." A quiet ooh rippled through the press row. Maddox raised an eyebrow, smirking. "I'm happy to oblige," he said, rising with the swagger of a man who had crushed dozens of deals in corporate boardrooms. He walked to the witness stand with a steady, self-assured stride. But Elliot didn't watch the posture. He looked straight into the man's eyes and saw something few ever dared to seek: a man who knew he was wrong, but believed he'd get away with it. Judge Craig gave a nod. "Mr. Maddox, do you swear to tell the truth?" "I do," Maddox replied, still smiling faintly. Elliot didn't open a folder. He didn't need documents. He simply asked, "Are you aware that the lot located at 2412 Ocean View Drive, the site of your luxury villa development, has been owned by me since 1991? Maddox blinked, then replied, "Our understanding is that the property lines were adjusted under the new zoning plan." Elliot tilted his head and followed up. "Did you see the small stone wall at the edge of the property? The fence my wife and I built with our own hands 30 years ago. When you poured the foundation," Maddox hesitated for a moment. "Yes, but the construction team believed it was an old marker with no legal standing." Elliot nodded. Then he pulled out a thin folder, the first warning letter he sent Maddox in April, demanding a halt to construction. "You received this letter, didn't you?" "I don't clearly recall," Maddox replied, leaning back slightly. "What about the second letter attached with a copy of the deed, survey records, and a certified county property map? I wasn't the one handling it directly." Elliot cut in, not sharply, not angrily, just with a cold, pointed question. "So what you're saying is, you authorized construction on a piece of land without bothering to check if it even belonged to your company?" A long silence followed. Maddox looked around. The confidence he'd worn all morning seemed to be dissolving bit by bit. Elliot stepped forward slowly and placed a photo on the stand. It showed construction workers tearing down the small stone wall, the fence he and his wife had once built. "Do you know what this fence was?" "An old structure from a previous..." "No," Elliot said, his voice lowering. "It was a promise. It was the last thing my wife touched before she passed." Maddox swallowed hard. Elliot turned to the jury. "I'm not standing here to win. I'm standing here to stop a habit of people who believe that if they have money, a legal team, and the right timing to ignore, they can take anything they want." He took a deep breath and stepped back to his table. No further questions. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Maddox sat down, but this time his head was no longer held high. Behind him, the moral foundation began to crack. That morning's session, which had already felt like a crescendo when Elliot grilled CEO Maddox to silence, was, in truth, only the opening act. After the recess, just as Judge Craig had returned to his seat, Elliot unexpectedly stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'd like to call an additional witness. This individual wasn't included in the original list." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Name of the witness." Elliot turned his head, his voice low but firm. "Dominic Alvarez, site foreman at the resort Mr. Maddox is constructing." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Maddox whipped around toward his attorney, whispering harshly, "Who let him in? Dominic's not in the file." Wyatt Mercer scrambled through his documents, frowning deeply. "I didn't authorize this." The back door of the courtroom opened. A man in his 50s walked in, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn-out work jacket, dusty boots, and a tired look in his eyes. Dominic Alvarez, the man who had overseen the actual construction of the contested site. He walked slowly to the stand, clutching a small USB drive in his jacket pocket. Judge Craig looked over at Elliot. "Does this witness have new information to offer?" Judge Craig asked. Elliot nodded. "Very new and very important." After Dominic was sworn in, the judge got straight to the point. "Mr. Alvarez, why are you appearing today without legal counsel, without a subpoena?" Dominic looked down at his calloused hands, then up at Elliot, the man he had never met in person outside of the job site. "Because I don't want to stay silent anymore." The courtroom held its breath. Elliot stepped forward. No paperwork, no elaborate introduction. "Can you tell the court, in your own words, what you witnessed during the construction of the resort at Ocean View Drive?" Dominic swallowed hard. "I was instructed to use the official blueprints, the ones we submitted to the city. But then I received an internal version. It had boundary changes. The company called it space optimization. But I knew it meant we were crossing the line." Elliot gently followed up. "Who gave you the order to use the second set of plans?" A tense silence gripped the room. Dominic looked toward Maddox. The man had gone pale. "Mr. Maddox gave the order directly." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A few reporters leapt to their feet, scribbling notes. Judge Craig slammed the gavel. "Order in the court." Elliot continued. "Do you have evidence?" Dominic nodded, pulling out the USB drive and holding it up. "I saved both sets of blueprints, the official submission and the altered internal version, along with the email that gave the directive." Judge Craig gave a firm nod. "Hand it over to the court clerk immediately." Maddox shot to his feet. "I object. This is surprise testimony, unverified." The judge didn't look at him. "We will verify the contents of the device, but if this testimony holds, it may be a pivotal piece of evidence." Elliot didn't need to say another word. He simply looked at Dominic and nodded, a silent thank you to a man who had chosen to do the right thing at the most crucial moment. Dominic gave a quiet nod in return. "I saw you standing here, all alone, unafraid, and I thought, if I stay silent, then I'm part of the wrong." Across the room, Maddox collapsed into his chair, sweat gathering on his forehead, while Attorney Mercer flipped through documents at a frantic pace like a man trying to escape an explosion he never saw coming. As soon as Dominic Alvarez handed the USB drive to the court clerk, Judge Craig called for a 20-minute recess to allow the technical team to examine the data. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. People left their seats, but no one stepped outside. Reporters murmured, cameras ready and pointed. On the defendant's side, Calvin Maddox, once the master manipulator, now sat frozen, fingers clutching the edge of the table, his gaze lost and hollow. On the other side, Elliot Granger remained still. His hand rested gently on his old leather briefcase, eyes gazing out the window. No excitement, no pride, just the patient stillness of a man who's seen too much of how the world works. Exactly 20 minutes later, The court clerk returned, handing Judge Craig a stack of freshly printed documents and a secure drive. Craig opened the file, his brows slowly knitting together. "We have verified the contents of the USB," he said, voice firm and unwavering. Inside were 2 sets of construction plans for the resort at Ocean View Drive, one submitted to the authorities and one internal version, with altered boundary lines. He paused, casting a sharp glance at Maddox, along with internal emails titled explicitly, "Push East Boundary. Increase area by 8.7%. Internal use only. Do not release this version." A faint groan slipped from Maddox's lips. He rubbed his forehead with a trembling hand. Wyatt Mercer, the once smug, self-assured attorney, now sat silent. He flipped through his notebook, though no words on the page seemed to matter anymore. Elliot stepped forward. No need for questions. He simply said, "Your Honor, this evidence confirms everything I've said from the beginning." Then he raised the photo of the stone fence, an image quiet and aching with truth. "This isn't just my land," Elliot said, holding up the photo. "This is where she, my late wife, once planted seeds. They knew that, and they still chose to destroy it for a few more villas." He turned to Maddox. "And now, you can't call it a misunderstanding anymore." Maddox sprang to his feet, his face flushed red. I didn't personally write that email. I only approved the final plan." Elliot looked him dead in the eye. "You don't need to type the words to be responsible. You just need to stay silent long enough." A heavy silence fell across the room. Judge Craig gave a solemn nod. "We will retain copies of this material as official evidence, and due to the seriousness of its contents, this court will not entertain any requests for delay." He turned to the jury. "We will now proceed to closing arguments." On Maddox's side, no one moved. Wyatt quietly buttoned his jacket, as if trying to tidy up what little dignity remained. And Maddox, the man who once ruled million-dollar boardroom deals, who once sneered at an old man defending himself, could now only sit there, watching everything unravel piece by piece, inch by inch. Elliot returned to his seat. No smile, no nod of victory, because he knew what he was protecting was never about winning, but about ensuring no one else had to endure being robbed in silence ever again. When Judge Craig declared, "It is time for closing arguments," the room barely breathed. Wyatt Mercer Maddox's counsel rose to his feet. The triumphant gleam he had worn that first morning was long gone, but his voice still tried to hold the rhythm of professionalism. He stepped toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, bowing his head slightly, "these past 3 days, you've heard a great deal, and I won't deny it's been shocking to see some of the evidence presented." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I ask that we remember this: the law exists to determine justice, not to validate emotion." A soft murmur rippled through the room. Wyatt continued, "Yes, Maddox Corporation made administrative errors. And perhaps some individuals within the team acted beyond their authority. But that does not make the entire project illegal, and it certainly does not prove intent to encroach. Boundary disputes anyone in the industry knows are common. This could have been resolved through mediation, had it not been dragged into the media spotlight. He turned toward Elliot. I respect Mr. Granger. I truly admire his courage in standing up for himself. But let's not forget, just because someone speaks first doesn't mean they're entirely right. Sometimes we all see things through the lens of emotion. With that, he lowered his head in a final gesture. I trust you will decide with reason, not sympathy. Then he stepped back, his eyes darting quickly across the jury, scanning for any flicker of reaction. Elliot remained seated. He didn't rush to rise. He simply unbuttoned his coat with care, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, then stepped forward. No paperwork, no thick folders. He stood just a few feet from the jury box. His gaze met each juror, not stern, not pleading, but calm, as if he were speaking to neighbors. I won't argue back. A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Elliot continued, I don't have a lawyer, no PR team, no real estate firm behind me. All I have is a piece of land where I've lived for nearly 30 years. There was a time I stayed silent. I thought I'm just one person who's going to listen. But when the sound of excavators came near that stone fence my wife once built, I knew if I didn't speak up this time, I wouldn't be myself anymore. He turned slightly, his eyes settling on Maddox. And if the law truly demands silence, as they claim, then maybe it's the law we need to rewrite. The entire courtroom fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. Elliot turned back to the jury. I don't need your sympathy. I only ask that you remember this. If one day some old man in some quiet town has his fence torn down, his land taken, and is laughed at for not having power, then remember, he could be me, and he deserves to be heard. He gave a slight bow, then walked back to his seat. No shouting, no long-winded arguments, because the courtroom already understood. The room was as silent as a chapel when Judge Craig rose. The jury will now retire to deliberate. Everyone knew the moment of truth was approaching. Elliot sat still, fingers gently interlaced, no trace of worry on his face. Maybe it was because he was old, or maybe it was because he knew he had done the right thing. On the other side, Calvin Maddox was unraveling. He whispered sharply to his attorney, fingers tapping the table in a nervous, erratic rhythm. Gone was the man who once sat atop a billion-dollar real estate empire. What remained was just another businessman who had gambled on greed and was losing. 30 minutes passed. The deliberation room door creaked open. The foreperson of the jury, a composed middle-aged woman, stepped forward, holding a large sealed envelope. Judge Craig looked down from the bench. Has the jury reached a verdict? The woman nodded. We are unanimous. The entire room seemed to inhale and hold. Judge Craig opened the envelope. He read silently for a few seconds, then looked up. The Court of Haven Ridge finds in favor of the plaintiff, Elliot Granger. A beat. Then the courtroom erupted. Murmurs, clapping, even a few relieved sighs. Judge Craig continued. The jury finds that the defendant, Maddox Urban Developments, knowingly trespassed on privately owned land, ignored formal requests to cease construction, and utilized unauthorized internal documents to expand the project. The defendant is hereby ordered to compensate the plaintiff for all civil damages including legal expenses, full restoration of the land, and an additional penalty for willful misconduct. Calvin Maddox slumped forward, his head dropping to the table. Wyatt Mercer quietly folded his files, his eyes staring into nothing. Elliot didn't move. He simply looked up at the judge, then at the jury, and gave a slow, steady nod. Judge Craig paused for a moment, then turned to Elliot. "Mr. Granger, do you wish to make a final statement before the court adjourns?" Elliot stood, not walking to the center of the room, just rising where he was, eyes drifting somewhere distant, as if seeing the old images of his land again, stone fences and rows of lavender. "I just want to say this. I didn't win because of eloquence. I didn't win because of reputation. I won because I didn't stay silent when something wrong was happening. And if today, an old man like me with no lawyer, no power can still be protected by justice, then maybe, just maybe, there's still hope in the law." There was no applause, only the quiet stillness of respect. Judge Craig gave a solemn nod. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down, but this time it didn't signal an end. It marked a beginning for all those out there who had once been ignored, taken from, and too afraid to stand up. The news exploded almost immediately. The local paper ran its front-page headline, "89-year-old man defends himself and defeats real estate giant in court." National television aired a special segment, "The People's Hero, Elliot Granger, and the Triumph of Truth Over Power on Social Media." A secretly recorded clip from the courtroom, Elliot holding up the photo of the stone fence and saying, "This was my wife's final promise," was shared over 3 million times within just 24 hours. People began to whisper to one another, "If he could do it, so can we." It's never too late to stand up. Justice shouldn't have to be bought. On the courthouse steps of Haven Ridge, Elliot Granger stepped into the soft afternoon light. He didn't stop for reporters. He didn't raise a fist or make a victory speech. He simply walked quietly toward the old pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot. But then, a voice called from behind Mr. Granger. Elliot turned. It was Dominic Alvarez, the construction foreman who had found the courage to bring the truth to light. His jacket was faded, hands still marked with dried paint from his final day on the site, but his eyes were clearer than they'd ever been. Two men, one once pushed outside the reach of justice, the other once forgotten by it, now stood face to face. Dominic spoke hesitantly. "I'm not good with speeches, but I just wanted to say thank you." Elliot looked at him and gave a quiet nod. "No, I'm the one who should be thanking you." Dominic hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slightly wrinkled business card. The words were clear: Alvarez and Sons, Residential Repair and Renovation. "If one day you need someone to rebuild that stone fence," he said softly, "I'll do it myself." no charge. Elliot gave a faint smile, not because of the generosity, but perhaps because he'd been waiting 30 years to hear that offer. He took Dominic's hand, gripped it firmly. "Just make sure you keep that promise." Dominic nodded this time, not as a worker taking orders, but as a man standing on his own terms. Farther away. Calvin Maddox slipped out a side exit, avoiding the cameras. He had not only lost the case, he had been exposed to millions. Calls from shareholders, PR consultants, banks were flooding in like alarm bells. A man who once built an empire of concrete was now standing on the rubble of his reputation. Elliot Granger climbed into his truck. Before closing the door, he glanced back at the courthouse behind him. That place, it wasn't where he won. It was where he refused to lose. 3 weeks after the verdict, Elliot returned to Ocean View Drive. No more fences blocking him, no more bulldozers, no more noise. Only the sea breeze remained, the faint scent of salt, and tall, sun-drenched grasses swaying over the ground once violated. Elliot stepped out of his truck. His old shoes sank slightly into the dusty road. He stood there for a while, saying nothing. His eyes scanned the quiet space around him, then settled on the corner where the stone fence had collapsed, where his wife's lavender once bloomed year after year. He walked toward it, kneeling. He picked up loose stones and gently began to stack them. No rush, no need for perfection, just something to hold the memory in place. Not long after, a truck pulled up beside his. It was Dominic Alvarez, just as he had promised. He brought a shovel, a measuring tape, guide string, and a wooden box filled with hand-picked stones. No grand introduction, no need for contracts. The two men shook hands like old friends and began rebuilding the wall together. Each stone, a marker, not just of property lines, but of defiance against forgetting. "How high do you want it?" Dominic asked. Elliot paused, then quietly answered, "Just high enough to keep the wind from carrying the scent of lavender off my land." They both laughed. No one spoke of the trial. No one mentioned Maddox, because in that moment, what mattered wasn't winning anymore. It was continuing. As the sun began to set, Elliot poured 2 cups of hot tea he'd brought from home, setting them down on a flat stone between them. They sat there, no titles, no status, just 2 men who had once been silent, now choosing to stand for what was right. "You know," Dominic said quietly, "I used to think my life would end on a job site, taking orders, doing wrong, and going home in silence." Elliot looked at him, and now Dominic took a deep breath. "Now I think, as long as I have the courage to speak the truth, I'm still human." The golden sunset spilled across the western sky of Haven Ridge. A breeze stirred Elliot's silver hair. In his jacket pocket was a folded letter from the city office confirming full ownership of the land. He didn't need to read it again, because everything he needed was already here, not in the papers. It wasn't about victory. It was about the land he once promised to protect, and now it had quietly kept him. That day, Elliot Granger didn't celebrate. He didn't pop champagne. He didn't go on talk shows. He didn't write a memoir titled The Trial of a Lifetime. He simply went home to the wooden cabin tucked deep in the forest, where everything was old, but nothing was meaningless. On the oak dinner table sat 2 teacups. One he placed there every night, as if his wife still sat across from him, waiting to hear about his day. That night, he spoke slower than usual. "I won," he said softly, to the cup, "but not because I argued better, because I didn't let them silence me." He poured more tea. The scent of star anise drifted gently on the breeze. "I know, maybe you'll never hear this," he said, "but if there's a soul out there still feeling lost, remind them an ordinary person, if they stand firmly for what's right, can shift an entire system." The following week, at a small community talk at the Haven Ridge Public Library, Elliot was invited to speak. He stepped up to the podium. No speech notes, no wireless mic, just a small quarter-folded piece of paper tucked into the pocket of his old coat. "I didn't come here to talk about winning or losing," he began. "I came to talk about something many people are starting to forget. Truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to stand firm." A young boy sitting in the front row raised his hand. "Mister, if they didn't listen to you at first, did you think about giving up?" Elliot looked at him and smiled gently. "I did. There were nights I sat alone, staring at that broken wall, and thought, maybe staying quiet would have been easier. But then I remembered, if I didn't do something, who would?" He looked up, his voice still soft, but somehow the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Justice isn't the sound of a gavel. It's not a headline. It's not fleeting fame. Justice is when someone with nothing left to lose still chooses to do what's right because they know if no one stands up, then wrong becomes law. The room was silent. No coughs. No one checking their phones. Because everyone understood they were witnessing something real. When Elliot finished, he bowed, then walked off the stage the same way he had walked out of the courtroom, without fanfare, without noise. But something behind him had shifted. A young woman scribbled on a sticky note, "I will speak the truth, even if my voice shakes." The elderly library guard stood and applauded for the first time in his 20 years of service. A group of students planned a visit to 2412 Ocean View Drive, not to take photos, but to learn what it means to protect what's right. And Elliot, he went home, boiled water, sat on the porch, looking west. He didn't hope people would remember his name. He only hoped that if one day someone has to stand alone for what is right, they'll know. He once stood there, too. I'm not alone, because once there was an old man, his name was Elliot Granger, who did it, and never regretted it. Elliot Granger didn't grow old because of time. He grew old every time he watched something wrong happen and no one stood up. But still, he chose to stand, not because he was strong, but because he knew if he didn't do it, there would be no one quiet enough left to speak what's right in a world deafened by the noise of power. And because he stood, another man, Dominic Alvarez, stood too. And from there, millions began to believe again. You don't need fame. You don't need a lawyer. You don't need a crowd. If you hold on to the truth, you are never truly standing alone. Elliot's story was never just about a land dispute. It was a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. It begins with someone who refuses to be silent. It starts with a hand placed on a broken fence, with a quiet sentence, "This is where she used to plant flowers," with an old man who stood before an entire system and said, "I'm not acting, I'm living." And then the court had to listen. Society had to pause. And we, the ones watching this video, must ask ourselves, if tomorrow something wrong comes knocking at my door, who will stand up? If you've ever felt small, ever been dismissed, ever thought, "I'm not enough to change anything," remember his name, Elliot Granger. And if this story moved you, leave a comment that says, "I choose what's right even if no one applauds." Because maybe, just maybe, that message will be what gives someone, somewhere, the courage to stand up tomorrow for what's right. If you've ever stood alone for the truth, or ever wished someone would stand for you, share this video. Because somewhere out there, an Elliot might need to know they're not alone. I choose what's right, even if no one sees. And if stories like this help you believe in courage again, hit like, subscribe to True Rank Stories, where the quiet voices finally get heard.